So welcome everyone. My name's Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Community Engagement Coordinator at the Haley Public Library. Tonight, our presentation is Hemingway's Retreat, a reading with author J. Michael Moriarty. And I always like to feature a book that we have here at the library, and you can kind of guess what that book's going to be. It's the book Hemingway's Retreat by tonight's author. It's a great fun read, kind of a rollicking read, so I think you'll enjoy it very much. It is my honor to introduce J. Michael Moriarty. He is a trial lawyer in Omaha, Nebraska, a former investigative reporter, and a regular visitor to the Wood River Valley. For many years, he visited Hemingway's grave at the Ketchum Cemetery and found himself wondering what might have happened if Hemingway had lived. So he decided to write the rest of the story. Hemingway's Retreat is the first book of this series and was followed by Hemingway's Return to England, which was published in 2020. Mick is writing a second series. This one is about Hunter S. Thompson, featuring Dr. Gonzo and Hemingway hunting Nazis in 1958. So please join me in offering a warm Zoom welcome to Mick Moriarty. And Mick, you'll need to unmute yourself. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is going to be a lot of fun. Thank you. And I'll mute myself now too.
Thank you. You can hear me okay? Can I enlarge the picture on the screen or not? Does that stay? Okay. Kristen, thank you very much, and the Haley Public Library. As you know, this was scheduled for March 25 of last year, but the pandemic had another way of dealing with it, and we were canceled last year, and it's great to have the opportunity to come back and read from Hemingway's Retreat. Also wanted to thank, by the way, Karen Bosick at the Eye on Sun Valley, the online publication, if you will, and network for the article they did on the book, and unwittingly on me, they have a photograph in there that had a picture of a couple individuals at Hemingway's grave, and they did not know it was me, but it turned out the picture that was in their archives was actually a picture of me, and they put that online today and credited that. Also wanted to thank Diane Meyer, the wife of Irish author Frank Delaney, for convincing me to do this because I didn't really want to. I didn't think doing a Zoom on a reading from a book would be something I wanted to do. As a matter of fact, I remember seeing Diane's husband, Frank Delaney, at the Kansas City Public Library do a reading, and it was just so great, but there were 200 people there, and it was really the only way I could understand doing a reading. But Diane convinced me that we're making a record, and as a lawyer, I understand making a record. So that's where we're at today. And a lot of those questions, some of which you set up, are questions that I can and will try to answer. You know, the big question is why? I think in a way, Ken Burns, the documentary, answered that question recently by saying people have been fascinated with this fellow for so many years, and he's so interesting that's why he did the documentary. And Burns said himself, Ken Burns said that there was a lot about Hemingway that he didn't know, and Lynn Novak, his co-producer, that they learned during it. And it's been kind of the same for me for a little bit longer period of time than Ken Burns was talking about. I've been sort of a student of Hemingway for maybe over 30 or 40 years. But I do appreciate the fact that the documentary was on recently and that it was so well done. As a matter of fact, I believe my brother Jim, who's watching right now, his studio in New Orleans helped with some of the, I don't know if it was production or post-production, but I know they worked with Ken Burns when he came back from Cuba. They had to help with some of the film. Besides the popularity of Hemingway even being more popular now with public television and the Ken Burns documentary, Hemingway is just always going to be somebody that people are fascinated by. And that is sort of what this story is about. It's giving him a second chance, giving him an opportunity to come back and see what I think he would do and what people think he should do. So, as they say, without further ado, I think the easiest way to start this is by reading from the preface. And in the preface, it's really my comments on why I was doing it at the time. So, reading from the preface, it's Sunday night, July 2nd, 2017, the middle of a long July 4 weekend. I've notified my young friends that today is the 56th year since the death of Ernest Miller Hemingway. He was 61 and was suffering from injuries and illnesses that caused him to take his own life. But things could have been different. In fact, he could have continued living. Of course, he wouldn't have been the same Hemingway. After all, his writing days seemed to be over, at least for novel writing. So what if destiny was altered and Hemingway did not die on July 2nd, 1961? Instead, he knew it was time for a major change. He needed to let the world know that the Hemingway that people knew would be gone forever. A new Hemingway would take his place. The change would take place abroad in Ireland. That's right. The death of Ernest Miller Hemingway was reported to the world, but under a new identity, Hemingway left his life of fame and went to live with a cousin in an old castle in County Limerick, Ireland. While the story about Hemingway's not dying and going off to Ireland to live, why that story? Well, mainly, I believe many of us were not ready for him to leave on this day 56 years ago. We want him back, at least for a while. The story begins with the lead up to July 2nd, 1961, and the events after that take place in Ireland. It's not known for how long he lives after July 2nd, 61, but for the time being, he is alive, and though not totally well and healed, is doing better than expected, physically and mentally. It's a time out for Hemingway in Ireland. Time to think, time to reflect, time to analyze. A chance to escape the pressures of fame and all of its trappings. As the jazz musician and philosopher Thelonious Monk said, gives the man time for introspection. Away from New York, Hollywood, away from the expectation of never-ending success, a chance to breathe. I'll let him do the rest of the explaining. After all, this is his story, his voice, his actions, his reflections on a life that he lived as the world-renowned author, and his newfound awareness of some of the principles that may have been forgotten during the life of fame. So it's time to take a journey with Ernest Miller Hemingway, now Matt Fitzgerald, in Ireland, 1961. Footnote: the truth is what Hemingway loved. He loved to talk about. He said that to write a book or a story, you start with one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know, he said. That's what I want this story to be. I want to bring him back for whatever time we can steal him from the man above. He was a father figure to many people around the world, Papa, and we miss him. Yes, we're aware of his problems, his failings, his weaknesses, but just like a member of our own family, we look for the good in people. The story begins. And further, he was called Papa. And To many, he was like a papa, someone to admire and look up to. He had a dream and he chased it with his body and his soul. He made it to the top, but he paid a heavy price, too heavy. Now it's time. He has a second chance, a chance to fix a few things and return to real life. So that's it. Meet Mr. Hemingway, soon to be Matt Fitzgerald. Come along for the ride. So that's my point of view. His is a little bit different. He talks about how he looks at the opportunity to live on in that new life and why he felt compelled to leave the old life. So in chapter 1 in the book, I don't know if my copy is better or shows, it's his tombstone. And on the tombstone, if you look carefully, you'll see the coins all over the place. There's a book on there I'll tell you about in a second. Possibly, depending on how the light is here, you can see there's dead flowers, there's a booze bottle, there's cigarettes, sort of a little bit of everything. People just come by his grave and they leave whatever. When I was there on that day in July of 2017 with Max Cottingham, and we took this photo, the only thing we changed was that book, that weathered copy of The Sun Also Rises, was on the tombstone, and we moved it down and covered the date of death. So it says on the book, date of birth, July 21, 1899, and then the date of death, instead of being July 2nd, 1961, is covered up by The Sun Also Rises. So that is the story. He didn't die. So in chapter 1 called Back When, he says, so everyone believes I died long ago, far away, July 2nd, 1961. Back when America was station wagons, hula hoops, popsicles, and fat cops. Kennedy was the new sheriff in town. Anyway, that was part of the backdrop in 1961. For me, and this is Hemingway talking, for me, I was sick and needed to, well, die or get out of town. I didn't have the nerve to die. That's the story. I didn't have the nerve to die. I have to admit it. So that's what brings me here. Maybe I won't write the great American novel ever again, but I'm still a reporter till the end. So here I will report, just like when I was a cub reporter, covering the traps of the Kansas City crime beat. What I'm trying to say is that from here on out, I'm just a simple reporter covering the details of my new life. And even if no one cares about this review of my new life, I still need to write things down to try to figure out who I am and what I've become. So that's basically the case, the book, the story, in a nutshell, from both my perspective and from his perspective. He was looking for a way out. He found his way out. He had the help from President Kennedy to get him a new identification and hook him up with his Fitzgerald cousins in Ireland so that he could go get away, similar to in the famous movie The Quiet Man, where John Wayne, who's a boxer who ended up killing a man in the ring in a match, and he left the country, he went to Ireland, and he started a new life and became a new person. So that's sort of the paradigm, the model for what Hemingway was trying to do in this case, and he talks about it. A lot of people don't know, Ken Burns covered this, not everything. I think I have just a few more details, but they're all very relevant on the issue of how injured was this guy? How many injuries did he really have? Were they that significant? Or is that exaggerate to cover up his disease that he had with alcoholism? So here's what my research shows. He said, of course, there were the wars and what they did to this old skin, shrapnel and wounds. And even while working for the Red Cross in World War I managed to get wounded, but I never let up. I gave this old body more injuries than 10 average men's bodies could endure. Plus malaria, pneumonia, hepatitis. The list is long and boring. Like I said, thank God, damn it. He gave me the body I needed to do the stuff I've done. Most people don't know that I once shot myself in the leg trying to wrestle a shark into a boat. It looked bad, but at least I was shark hunting. Makes it easier to admit my poor shot. Hell, I haven't even mentioned my plane crashes in Africa. That first one was bad, but that second one damn near killed me. My brain still ain't right. Thank you, thank you, God. See, I'm no atheist. Then there's my literary life. I know it's probably over and I'll never be good again. I mean, hell, I can't think straight. And I couldn't write a good story if my life depended on it. My cherished life in Cuba, yeah, that's gone too. I had to leave when the revolution came. And I'll probably never see my finca, my little farm, ever again. Mary knew that I was leaving her. She understood that I would probably never be back, that I had to leave, disappear, try to heal, try to find the old me. If not, then I would just give up. And I would go gently into the night, just fade away, fade, 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 until gone. Now, besides the injuries that Hemingway talks about in that section of the book, on page 50, he says, besides, he goes back to the injury issue. He goes, it started with the mortar shell shrapnel in World War I in Italy. And then I got shot in the leg and wounded, carrying a soldier off the field. He talks about the shooting and when he was in the boat with the shark, always a bad idea, he says. But I survived anthrax, malaria. These are additional to the ones I had before. Pneumonia, dysentery, hepatitis, and anemia. Additionally, in the plane crashes in Africa, he had first-degree burns, internal bleeding, ruptured kidney, ruptured spleen, ruptured liver, as well as a fractured skull. So much for me, he said. So, yes, he was suffering at the end from the history of the drink, as they say, but he also had a long, long list of serious injuries. There's a doctor here locally who, as a young boy, was fishing in the Wood River, and his dad let him go fish, and he caught his limit, and he had some fish eggs or salmon eggs that he offered to the guy fishing next to him. And the guy said, son, when he offered him, he said, son, I don't bait fish. He went home and he told his dad, he goes, it was this mean old man in the river, Dad. And I offered him some bait because he wasn't catching anything. And he just wasn't very nice to me. And his father, who worked for the Union Pacific here in Omaha, said, well, did he have a big gash up on his forehead? And he said, yeah. He goes, son, that was Ernest Hemingway. So that's a true story. Yeah, he wasn't nice to that kid, but he said he didn't bait fish. The human side. This is a reading, chapter 4, called The Way Out. And this is after the funeral. Suffice it to say, there was a nice funeral service. There was no open casket, per my wishes. Everybody just had to believe it was me in that plain pine box that I asked for in my will. When I saw photos of my burial in the New York Times, I came to learn that I did not get my pine box last request. They got fancy on me with an ornate coffin. That was okay because it had locks on it, so no one could open it up and find me missing. I thought long and hard about what I would do. After I died, I concluded I could not go back to my old haunts, else trouble for me. So I had to go somewhere I had never lived before. It had to be out of the United States because I was too well known and maybe recognizable, although my looks had changed and I had gotten old. As a matter of fact, I didn't even look like the Hemingway I had known my whole life. I was okay to travel because Mary got me a passport through her friendship with our new president, Jack Kennedy. What a great guy. After and later, he arranged with Castro to let Mary go back to my Cuban home to collect my valuable things. Mary's gone, but she writes about it in her book a little bit, I believe. But Valerie Hemingway tells a great story about what it was like when Valerie and Mary went back to Cuba. Even it was during the blockade, and just those two were allowed to go and retrieve whatever they could carry. And that's all that they were able to get out of Hemingway's home. But the fact is, the president and Castro, that was the only agreement that we know of that let anybody go to Cuba. The reading on, he says, I have a new identity. I'm in chapter 5, and he calls that, the chapter is called The New Me. I have a new identity. I'm now Matt Thomas Fitzgerald. I'm known as Matt. My destination is Ireland, hence the Irish name. Since I got my new identity from President Kennedy, I'm sure he got a big laugh out of making an Englishman by heritage into an Irishman by the power of his pen. Anyway, thank you, Mr. President. And now this story of my new life. It was a quiet adios to America, just like many times before. This time I didn't know if I'd ever be back. That bothered me until I thought about it. The fact was, for all my years of travel to battlefields and war zones and worse, I never really had any expectation of coming home. I just didn't care or didn't care to think about it. That was because of my job and my choice of occupation. I always enjoyed danger. It made me feel calm and whole, in my element, as they say. Continuing in that same section, that same chapter. Ireland to me was a place to go when your world fell apart, like it was for the boxer, Sean Thornton, in the movie The Quiet Man. After he killed a man in the ring, he hung up his gloves and went to the Emerald Isle to start over, back to the old homestead of his youth. I identified with John Ford's tale of returning to the boxer's homeland. It would be my new homeland too. Just another Yank coming back home, I'd tell those people. I made my money in America and I was coming back home to Ireland to spend it. Just like John Wayne, Sean Thornton, the boxer. No Irish person could find fault with that. Share the wealth with your own. So that leads us up to, sufficiently covers the backdrop of what he did, why he did it, where he was going, how he got there with the help of the president, and how he ends up in Ireland. And we didn't really, at this point yet, talk much about what really happened. But what happened is that Hemingway, it'll later show in these books, a series, and there's even a play about this now. Hemingway went and stayed in the White House for a few days while Kennedy got him the passport, and he became Matt Fitzgerald. Kennedy contacted his relatives over in Ireland, the Fitzgeralds, who live at a famous old castle in Lower Limerick, overlooking the Shannon estuary. It's called the Glynn Castle. It's a real place. And there was a real Des Fitzgerald, who I did meet and got to know a little bit. Great guy. And prophetically, years ago, I asked him if I could sometime use reference to him being the 29th Knight of Glyn in Glyn Castle and all of these things that go along with the Fitzgerald clan. And Desmond Fitzgerald told me, well, sure. He goes, it's all kind of fictitious anyway. He goes, we don't really follow that in Ireland. So that's how we ended up with Des Fitzgerald and Glyn Castle, and the fact that I had been there and it was a real place and is still there and is just an amazing, amazing place. So Hemingway goes and gets set up through the president contacts his cousin, said, we have a cousin over here who has been a war reporter, war correspondent, pretty beat up. He's had a tough life. He's covered wars since the First World War. Again, it's 1961. He says, could you guys look out for him, put him up, get R&R over in Ireland? And of course, the cousins, for you, cousin, President Kennedy, we will do whatever. And so that's the way that Hemingway gets there as Matt and becomes Matt Fitzgerald and lives in the Glyn Castle in Limerick. So when September came to Glyn Castle, so he had been there now for a month and a half. When September came to Glyn Castle, this is 1961, I was ready to go explore Ireland. I had rested for weeks and was eating good food. I had made friends with the town doctor who said that my medical history would provide a good case study for a medical student to present to colleagues. Dr. J. Halley was a frequent visitor to the house, and I found some humor in his health summary where he said that my list of ailments and injuries sounded like the stuff of a novel. If he only knew, I thought, but I don't think he had any clue about the former me. Des agreed it was time to go to get me out and about. So he proposed that we should go visit some of his friends, and in particular, a fellow by the name of John B. Keane, who's a famous Irish writer, playwright, novelist, kind of Mr. Everything in County Kerry. And so we set about a plan, and I started reading about John B. Keane because I had never heard of him before. And in chapter 9, which says, which is called To County Kerry We Will Go, Hemingway says, Matt Fitzgerald that is, I felt a sense of fear when I heard about John B. Keane's occupation. But then I figured, what the hell? I didn't know a thing about John B. Keane, his books or plays. What I didn't realize at that time was how much John B. knew about the man he called Papa. Also, I was soon to learn that I should have known about John B., as they called him. He wasn't well known by the world audience for whatever reason, but he was already a giant in Ireland. And as I read about him, I felt more human. When I read his explanation of the influence of home in his writing, in his case, home was County Kerry. I read that John B. said that as a writer, this is so important, as a writer, you belong to the elements, to the spheres spinning in the heavens. You belong to history and language and romance and ancient song. And he said, it's an awesome responsibility. I was moved by his wisdom and couldn't get his ideas out of my mind. Maybe it's more amazing that I know and understand what he's talking about. My brain seems to be working again, maybe. Another John B. saying was, don't mind the big fellows. They can look out for themselves. Look out for the small man. Listen to him. He'll tell you the truth. I felt that John B. was the new me. And if I would ever write again, I thought, I would want to be John B. Keane. He became my hero before I ever met him. So that's interesting. not known for his humility about other writers, although there were a few that he praised, especially James Joyce. But I thought that that was important, that Hemingway recognize how great John B. Keene was also. And so they went to the town, the little town that John B. lives in, and it's called Listowel, and it's in what they call North Kerry. And in Ireland, Kerry is referred to, for some reason, the history, as the kingdom. So if you're ever in Ireland and people ask you where you're from, and if you have a name like mine, which is associated with Kerry, the first thing out of their mouth may be, "Oh, Moriarty. So you're from the kingdom, are you?" Well, the Moriartys are from County Kerry. County Kerry is, for whatever reason, by history, referred to as the kingdom. So they roll into Listowel, Des and Matt Fitzgerald, Mr. Hemingway. And it's really about, it's not the first outing, but it's the first significant outing. They go into John B. Keene's business as a pub, which he runs with his wife, Mary. So in chapter 10, about John B., we sat down by the fireplace in the back of the pub. I talked to John B. while Des caught up with Mary. I asked him about his books and plays, but he said he wanted to talk about me. Des said that you've traveled all over the world, seen it all. World War I, the Second World War II. That's amazing. You must have been a dedicated reporter, Matt, to do that work. And you were even at D-Day. My Lord, Matt, it sounds like you were following the footsteps of Eisenhower, Patton, and even Hemingway. Well, yes, you're right. It was hard work. And yes, we would see all the generals and Mr. Hemingway at times. It seemed the Army brass always wanted to know where he was. They always wanted to get mentioned in his books and his magazine articles. Those same Army officials saw me and they went the other way. They didn't want to appear in my stories, I laughed. Papa, they called him Papa. He was quite an inspiration to guys like me, telling the stories of the common man, the down-to-earth regular people, and his mastery of the condensed language, John B. said. Well, he was all that, I said. You're lucky to have met him, Matt. I so much wish I could have sat down and had a glass of beer with Papa and talked about just one thing, finding what's true. God, I wish I could have done that. Pull that pint. Pulling the pint is serving the beer. And then Hemingway and Des head off to the races in Listowel. They were there for race days in Listowel, so it's kind of a big deal. And then they went off to the races, and afterwards they came back to sit down. And as they did, they returned to the pub, and Des again is talking to Mary, and Hemingway, Matt Fitzgerald begins. As the crowd dropped off around dinner time, John B. was able to get out from behind the bar. Let's sit at my table in the back, Matt, he said. Des was talking with old friends and waved me on as if he would join me soon, which he did not do. Instead, just John B. and I sat down at the table. I convinced him we needed to talk about him now, I said. I've been talking about me for weeks and I need to quit talking and start listening more. I'm in Ireland. I need to learn more about my homeland that I know so little about. John B., he agreed to teach me about Ireland as long as I would tell him about all the places in the world that I had been to. And of course, about America. We have a deal, I said. So we do. Now where to begin, John B. said. I don't think many people know that I met Mary on a Friday night during the Listowel races. It's hard for me to talk about myself. My stories, this is so important, my stories and plays are about real people. And then John B. says, these things that I just think that if Hemingway would have had a chance to meet him, I think that they just would have been the greatest friends. He said, I don't think many people know about how he met Mary. My stories and plays are about real people. And he says, I can actually see them from my window right above the pub. I look over the streets of Listowel from there, and I see a world that seems immense, even though we're just a small village, really. But there's so many stories, and I know them. I know the people, and I know what they will do in a given situation, for better or worse. I'll never forget that during a local performance of one of my plays, a woman loudly said, "That's me." It wasn't, but it could have been. Another example, a friend of mine wrote a book about his hometown of Tipperary, and he was afraid to go there to do a reading. He thought that the people there would be hard on him for what he said about Tip Town. That's what they call it, Tip Town. Even though the book was fiction, it was a beautiful novel. Well, he was sort of right. One fellow got up to ask if the old woman wearing the scarf on page so-and-so was his Aunt Hannah. And so it went that night. They loved the book because it was their story. It wasn't from Dublin or Cork, not even a Limerick city tale. It was Tip through and through, and it was them. It was their story. Nobody else's, really. It was true. Back to the theme that never ends when you're talking about Hemingway. True. Was it true? So John B. then says, that's what I think, Matt, and that's what I believe. He says, the fact that I write stories and plays is incidental. He's pretty humble. He says it's incidental, actually. I'm more a collector of tales and a curiosity seeker when it comes to people. Every person has a story to tell, he said. So it seems that my job is endless. And John B. says, long after I'm gone, I hope the young folk then will consider how lucky they are to be alive and surrounded by so many wonderful people who have their millions of tales to tell. I think that on the one hand, but I'm also mindful of what Tolstoy said. In literature, there are really only two stories. Man, woman, goes on a journey, or stranger comes to town. I guess it doesn't matter. What matters is that the stories get told so that we can keep track of who we are and what we've become, and finally, what to do about it. That's what I'm thinking today, Matt. If you come back tomorrow or next week, I may have a different idea. I don't know. I know today, I know how I feel, and I believe I can find truth in these tales told by this Carey man. So, a lot of serious stuff. And I brought along with me a chapter from the Hemingway's return to England, because there's a story in there that brings a little levity to the subject matter. And when one of our friends knew that I was working on Hemingway and going to England in 1961, 62, I'll keep moving along here. She asked me if Hemingway would meet the Beatles. And my first reaction was I thought she was being facetious, but she wasn't. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that is definitely worth thinking about. So I thought about it and thought about some more and did a little bit of research into the Beatles and when they were playing, where they were playing, and how that matched up to our timetable, because we have a very, very tight timetable, because Mr. Hemingway goes to England in November of 1961. So that's only 4 months into his new life as Matt Fitzgerald. And so if you're going to see the Beatles, you need to know what's going on in late 61, early 62. So we found out, and I want to read a chapter. It's called From Hemingway's Return, and that book looks like this. It's the cenotaph in London, Whitehall Road, surrounded by an artist's version of poppies surrounding. The cenotaph is essentially the tomb of the unknown, where the poppies are laying every year on the Sunday nearest. Remembrance Day is the Sunday nearest, the 11th of November, and then at 11 a.m. there's 2 minutes of silence to honor the dead and to remember the dead. And so that's what takes Hemingway there, as that book will, when you see it, you'll realize. Maybe we'll be back to read from it later on. We'll see. Not tonight. But I will read a part from the Beatles, chapter 6, the Beatles in Kilimanjaro. When we arrived in Liverpool, Brian Epstein met us at the station. Now, it turns out that the background is Des had gone to school in London with Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles. After a late lunch, Brian took us to a town flat, which was specifically for his music visitors. We actually need a few more places for people to stay, Brian said. People are coming from all over the world to see these young musicians who are going to change the face and the sound of music around the world. They're John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They're the Beatles. I know I've never heard of them, Des said. Same here, I added. Well, within months, the whole world will know who they are, Epstein promised. Then he walked over to the kitchen table in the flat. Here, listen to a couple of their records on the record player. It'll give you an idea, he said. Love Me Do played. Then P.S. I Love You was the next record. Finally, he played Till There Was You. Brian was right that it was music like something we had never heard before. Des and I both liked it. It was new, but it was old too. Well, I hope you liked it. Tonight, we're going to go see the band play live, Brian said. We're going to the Cavern Club, where the boys are playing every night to packed crowds. And it was a short walk to the Cavern Club on Matthew Street in Liverpool. It was February 1962. And although Ringo Starr was playing drums that night, he wasn't in the band yet. Brian said he was trying him out. Pete Best was still our main drummer, but Ringo said he's the band's new drummer. Well, we had great fun that night listening to Brian's boys. He was grooming them for the big leagues, he said. And when we saw how wild the fans were, we knew he was grooming them for something big. We just hoped it would work. The Beatles put on a good show in the Cavern. The music was good. And the band members were funny, always injecting humor on stage. After the show, Brian introduced us to the band members. They were all very personable and down to earth. Hey, Matt, John Lennon said, you look like the old man of Kilimanjaro. All the boys laughed. I knew what he meant, but he said it in a mixed up way. I told them that Kilimanjaro, the snow-covered mountain Kilimanjaro, was 19,710 feet high. The highest mountain in Africa, I told those boys. Just remember, boys, those snow caps are melting there. So this is interesting because here Hemingway, Matt Fitzgerald, is talking about climate change in 1961. And just so everybody knows, the fact is, it was known that the snow and ice caps of Kilimanjaro were starting to melt. The scientists knew it, and that was published information in 1961, 62. Just remember, boys, the snow caps are melting there. And in your lifetime, they may be gone, I told them. And if you boys have any success in the music business, I hope you remember your solemn duty to the natural environment and mankind. Preserve the earth for future generations. So this is Hemingway, the naturalist, talking. That's great advice, Brian said. My God, Matt, the boys are right. You remind us of old Mr. Hemingway, God rest his soul. At that moment, the boys started singing a tune to me. I won't sing, but I'll read it. Old Mr. Hemingway, don't forget to save the earth and sky, and don't forget to do it all on the fly. There may not be time, so don't give up too soon. Save Kilimanjaro, and while you're at it, save the moon. We all laughed for a good long time, and then the boys shook our hands and promised to remember the importance of protecting the wonders of the natural world, as well as the air we breathe and the water we drink. You're right, Matt. Thanks for reminding us that we have these new responsibilities as we become more well-known. People will look up to us, and we can have an impact on the future of our generation. So spoke John Lennon. As we left the cavern, I felt that I had actually made an impact on someone's life. I thought maybe these boys would be successful. And if so, I truly believe they would try to do some good deeds with their fame and fortune. And on the walk back to the flat, Brian told us a few stories about his musical group. He said their previous manager said, don't touch them with a barge pole. And he told Brian they can't be trusted. I didn't see it that way, Brian said. I believe in them, and I know I'm right. They'll be bigger than Elvis. So it was important that an outsider from America, Matt, could give them some advice about their future and their legacy. As we walked along, Des and I started humming the song, Love Me Do. And then Brian began singing the song in the street too. It seemed like the music really echoed all night in our sleep. And after making our way back to London the next day, we were met at the train station by our trusted driver and friend, Johnny Hempel. Brian Epstein called and gave me the train arrival information, Johnny said. He said, you guys had a great time with the band at the Cavern Club. They're great young people with tons of talent. I saw them over Christmas up north, thanks to Brian, of course. They seem to be on their way to the big time. I hope you both gave them some good advice on how to handle fame and success. I didn't, Des said, but Matt sure did. He told them they had responsibilities to preserve nature and the environment. Water, air, everything under the sun people take for granted, like the snow caps of Mount Kilimanjaro. Matt warned them of changes coming in their lifetime, like the melting of the snow and the ice caps caused by pollution. The boys were receptive, and they thanked Matt a lot. They even joked with us and made up a little song about Matt. Old Mr. Hemingway, they called him. Save the earth and sky, and don't forget to do it on the fly. And if we don't try today, who knows about tomorrow? So do your best. We'll all be blessed, and save Kilimanjaro. The boys said Matt reminded them of the old man at Mount Kilimanjaro, Des said. I think they were pretty confused with the old man and the sea, Matt said, but that's okay. Hemingway wouldn't mind. He would be happy just to know people were thinking about his stories. That really hits home with this book and with this character that I'm trying to create, in that who wouldn't be happy knowing that people are still thinking about him? Well, I'm glad that you talked to them, Matt, and gave them some guidance for going out into the big world, Johnny said. They'll have fun and do some good things too, Des agreed. You know, they're young lads, and someday soon the whole world will know who they are. I feel fortunate that we got to meet them and see the magic of their performance, Des said. They will truly rock the world. They are the Beatles. So I don't know if it's a good time to take a break. Kristen, if we should have questions now, I could go on a little bit, but I feel like I've read quite a bit.
You know, Mick, I actually have a couple of questions for you. In Hemingway's Retreat, each chapter focuses on a particular town or area. You really highlight hunting hounds, you really highlight steeplechase horses in a different one. And each chapter is like a snapshot of that general area. And I wondered a couple things: why you chose that vehicle to tell your story, and if you're familiar with those areas, and then why you picked those particular, I don't know, subjects to focus on to tell that story. I found that very interesting how you did that.
Well, if I could interpose, as we say in court, if I could interpose an objection, compound question, ma'am.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. If we could break that apart one at a time. The first part of your question was
stylistic.
okay.
What made you decide to
that.
choose? Okay.
I got that. And that could go back to, I remember studying of all things, Spanish literature back in college. And I remember reading a book in Spanish called El Sombrero de Tres Picos, and it was where a boy went from town to town to town. And then they talked about how that was so similar to the story, the second most read book in the world, Don Quixote. How he went from town to town. Again, his mission, and I think in the book, Hemingway Fitzgerald explains that by saying that he goes, "I'm no Don Quixote." I think it's in the second. I'll find it here. I think it's in the PPS, if you will, at the very beginning. He says. I guess it's just in the PS. He says, upon reflection and review, oh, I'm sorry. This is me saying it, not him. It says, upon reflection and review at the switching hour of midnight on July 4, it strikes me that the story is like the musical journey that Bono described years ago when explaining a new album. The journey here is the trek to Ireland. The music is the theme of Hemingway's life, the written word. Mm-hmm. Bono was echoing the words of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and others who have said that there are only two stories to tell that I described before. Mm-hmm. We're also reminded of the hero in the great novel by Cervantes, Don Quixote. Quixote was a sick man, physically and mentally, but he set out to travel and make his life one of adventure. He even thought he was living in a castle. By the way, the travel did help him regain his sanity. Comparisons abound, but so what? This is about Hemingway, not characters of culture, history, or literature. And so that's kind of one of my ideas. I don't know. There's probably more to it that I thought about, but right now, that's all I can think of as to why I did it that way. As to the particular events and people he saw, things he did, those are pretty much things that I'm familiar with from my travels in Ireland. We always, when I'm there, we're always going to the races and visiting the hunts and meeting the people in the hunts and the people in the horse world. My wife has been in the horse world her whole life and has been to, not as a competitor, but her horse actually went to one of the Olympic Games. And so horses are sort of in our family. So that's part of the emphasis on the horses. And they're a great vehicle when you're talking about Ireland, because Hemingway, I think it's in chapter 22, he says, every single day I've been here, there's horses. What's going on? And he says, or whoever he's talking to at the time, I think it was a fellow by the name of Bill Harrington, who was quite a significant person in the horse world in Ireland. They said, well, there are horses in your life every day in Ireland. That's just the way it is. You turn on the TV and you may not see a football game, but you will see the horses racing live from racetracks all around the country. And they race in the summer on the turf, on the flat, and in the winter, they race over the jumps. And Hemingway says at one point, he goes, I don't understand. He goes, they seem to have it backwards, but that's called the Irish racing over jumps in the winter. And that steeplechase is what they call it in England and America, but over there it's Irish racing. And anyway, that's that part of it. I think there was a third part to your question.
No, I think that you answered kind of the last couple parts, but just a personal note, for some time I traveled overseas for a couple years, and one of my traveling companions during that time was from Glyn, Ireland. And so I knew that Hemingway in your book went to Ireland, but I didn't realize he went to Glyn. And so it was fascinating to me to learn a little bit about the area that my friend Owen O'Shaughnessy, I mean, can you get a more Irish name than that? The community that he lived in. And then a couple of other questions, and maybe other people have questions as well. I noticed that the young writer, was it Hamus or Haney?
I was going to get there if you let me.
Okay. And then Maureen O'Hara, I was going to ask you kind of about those couple of people.
Can I come back to Maureen O'Hara, but you brought up Glyn, and there is a section on Glyn, and I would love to read that part.
Sure, please do. I'll mute myself.
It's called Poetry Comes to Town on Saturday Night. And Des said that we were going to town to hear a young poet on Saturday night. I was so happy. I couldn't believe how my spirit was lifted by the mention of a poet. Of course, it was no one I'd ever heard of before, but that didn't matter. Just the thought of hearing work from a poet was exciting. Des said we would hear some poetry by a brilliant young man from the north of Ireland, Seamus Heaney. Young Heaney was to read some of his poems at the local community center in Glyn, the little town of Glyn. Des said there would usually be 15 to 25 people at these type of events, but on this night, more than 100 people were at the center to hear a 22-year-old poet that nobody knew anything about. But all of Glyn read in the paper that Heaney would someday be on the same pedestal with Yeats. Well, the paper was right. He was a poet that you could listen to all day. So few words and so much meaning. Poets put us book writers to shame. What they do takes so much more skill. And so Seamus Heaney says, I want to share with you a poem that I'm working on, but it isn't complete. Now, the reason we had to do that is because this is 1961 and this poem isn't out yet. So I'm trying to tie some historical accuracy here with this poem, because the poem becomes so important in Seamus Heaney's life and has a lot to do with him getting a Nobel Prize in Literature. Might as well read it to you people here, see what you think. He then proceeded to read from a poem that he said was called The Digging, which I recommend to everybody. It was about the hard work done by his father and grandfather in digging turf. He admitted that he may not have the physical strength and the stamina of his predecessors, but he had this pen. He had this pen. And with this pen, he admitted, with this pen, he will dig with it, not for Pete, like his father and grandfather did. Heaney will dig for truth, back to Hemingway. He will dig for truth and understanding in the land that he knows. And after more readings of some short poems and what have you, there was a break at the Glyn Community Center. And Matt Fitzgerald Hemingway says, we had a chance to meet the poet. I congratulated him. And I'm reading from page 58 of the text. I congratulated him for his fine work and encouraged him to stick with it and told him someday he would find himself on the receiving end of a Nobel Prize in Literature for his poetry. Thank you for your kind words, he said. Normally I would want to say you're a little too optimistic about my work, but with you, Matt, I feel like you know whereof you speak. Heaney said, it means a great deal to me, sir. What you said. I mean, I don't know how or why we've been brought together for this meeting, but I want you to know I will always remember this moment and I will not let you down. How strange, I thought, this young poet would accord such high praise to me, a reporter, a war reporter. Everyone was told that I was a war correspondent and a reporter from the United States and Canada. I remember the words of a war correspondent, Heaney said, being a journalist is important. This is so important. This is Hemingway. Being a journalist, and Heaney is telling Hemingway, Matt Fitzgerald, he's quoting Hemingway. And so it's very confusing. But Heaney says being a journalist is important, he remembers, but writing fiction is more important. Because a writer has only so much creative juice. A writer's job is to tell the truth. And with a fidelity to the truth, he can produce, this is so important, he can produce a truer account than anything factual can be. You really have to think about that for a long, long time after this Zoom is over. He has the time and the scope to create an absolute truth. I mean, this is what Hemingway talked about. And it's not easy to understand and it's not easy to believe. So then Fitzgerald Hemingway says, I realized he was quoting me from Men at War, the introduction that I wrote back at the beginning of World War II. Pretty close to home, I thought. Then I thought how true it was. There is only so much juice, and mine is gone. I know that. And I'll be lucky if I can get back to being half the journalist I once was, even to be a cub reporter again, an old one at that. Fine, I would do it in a heartbeat. But Heaney, what's up with the Hemingway quote, I thought. I hope to meet you again, Seamus, I said. Desmond, thank you for coming to the readings, and thank you for bringing your cousin. It's truly been a great honor that I will always remember. Des gave me a puzzled look. He never said anything, nor did I. I don't know how we're doing time-wise.
We're doing fine. So you can talk about Maureen O'Hara as you go along, but one of my question about that is is this gentleman the poet's name Heaney or Haynes? Heaney?
Heaney.
Heaney.
Yeah, Heaney.
So
Yeah,
Heaney kind of recognizes Hemingway, and you can talk a little bit more about Maureen O'Hara recognizing Hemingway. But I got to the end of the book wondering if any of these folks were going to like spill the beans, you know, and to me, your book kind of left me hanging, wondering in book 2 or 3 or 4, if this was all going to kind of fold back in. And
I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if I should answer that question.
But go ahead and talk about Maureen O'Hara if you'd like. I was just curious about that.
They go. Des actually probably did know her. And I met somebody, a friend of hers, a lady that worked for Maureen O'Hara at the Foynes Airboat Museum, which is not far away from where they're at. They're in Cary, Limerick area. And it's called an airboat museum. And there used to be these airboats that would fly into, before regular planes that would fly into Ireland and Europe. And the airboat was big in that area, the west of Ireland, and there's this museum, and Maureen O'Hara was very involved in perpetuating and funding the museum, And so on their trip, their outing, if you will, Des and Matt go there and they're going to meet her. And apparently in 1959, she was filming a movie down in Cuba. And he remembered that he met her there, but he didn't know if she would recognize him. And when they got there, she did immediately recognize him. And they had quite an interesting conversation, and they actually separated off. If I could find the section real quick, I would read from it, but I'll let people read it on their own. It's pretty fascinating. The two of them get together and talk, and of course she hugs him and says, "I can't believe that, you know, you're still alive." So I guess that lets the cat out of the bag right there. She did know him, and she did recognize him, and they have a fascinating conversation. And I don't know, he was always in love with her from a distance because of the role she played in the great movie that's the model for this whole story of the book, The Quiet Man. She was the woman that John Wayne, Sean Thornton fell in love with, Maureen O'Hara. Her name was Kate Danaher, and I think the chapter in the book refers to her name. And whether I can find it that quickly, I might be able to. Yeah, chapter 21, Meeting Mary Kate Danaher. And see if I can, my note says I can read from it if time permits. Okie dokie, here I feel well, Mary Kate Danaher, Des said, invoking one of my all-time favorite characters in the movie, The Quiet Man. I am so glad to see you, and I'm happy to be back home for a while, Maureen said. The museum is a major part of local Irish history that we do need to save, Des. This is my cousin, Matt Fitzgerald, from America, originally from Ireland, like you, Miss Danaher. Nice to meet you, Matt. I hope you're one of the good Fitzgeralds. Des told me that he is the Fitzgerald that I should trust if it ever becomes necessary for me to kiss a Fitzgerald. It should only be Desmond, my knight of Glyn in shining armor. Well, on the face of it, it sounds like good advice, but I caution you, sometimes Des goes missing and he simply can't be found. And if that happens, and there is an urgent need to kiss a Fitzgerald, then I should have my name added to your list of acceptable Fitzgeralds suitable for kissing, I explained. Well, thank you, Matt, she said. That's good information for a girl to know. We all laughed and walked into the museum. I've seen many beautiful women over the years, but Maureen was simply stunning. This is 10 years after The Quiet Man. The years have been kind to her, I thought. At Maureen's suggestion, we all walked around the museum, and she explained as we went along. And although there's a maritime museum and an aviation museum, we only went through the aviation museum. Excuse me, I'm switching glasses here. As Maureen showed us the flying boat replica, I told her I flew on the original B-314 from New York to Foynes. Foynes is that part of Ireland, when I was working as a foreign correspondent. She says, I always wanted to marry a foreign correspondent. She said, I'm shocked, Maureen. I said, I wish Des would have told me that a few years ago. Matt, we didn't know each other until a few months ago when cousin John Fitzgerald Kennedy introduced us, Des said. That sounds like a weak excuse, Maureen said. I agree, I said. Des, you know, I would have left the battlefield to come to Ireland to meet Maureen. I don't know what you were thinking when you didn't track me down. Okay, I messed up, Des said. I clearly should have set you two up on a date back during the war when war correspondents were top dog. Yes, sir, I said. Instead, I had to look at GI pinup posters of Maureen, when I should have been in County Limerick providing her with up-to-date information from the continent and the subcontinent, as only a foreign correspondent could do. That is starting to sound very interesting, Matt. Maybe Des could go visit the Maritime Museum while we stroll around and check out the luxury accommodations of the big replica. Are you suggesting I get lost? Des said. Well, we'll meet you for lunch in 1 hour, Des said. With that, we were on our way to the B-314, the flying boat. The aircraft was true luxury, like an ocean liner. There was a 14-seat dining room, honeymoon suite, sleeping berths for all the passengers, and various amenities for crew and passengers. After Des left, we went inside the off-limits to the public B-314 and sat down. I knew I was not fooling Maureen. I must say, old friend, I never expected to see you again. I can't believe my eyes, Maureen said. Then she hugged me for several minutes and she cried. I'm not sad, just emotional, happy. I'm glad to see you're alive. And I'm so happy you've come to Ireland. This is the perfect place. And Des is the perfect cousin. Thank God for President Kennedy. I agreed. Cheers to Des and the Prez. You know, we have photos of you and we have some of your ticket stubs here in the archives, Maureen said. Oh, I remember, and I signed a lot of books for the staff. I think they were all just off the press. First edition, For Whom the Bell Tolls. We sat down and started talking. I know you're still very close to the Duke, that's John Wayne. All the movies you made together, I understand. But I had a problem with his politics and his support of that Joseph McCarthy and the un-American activities and all that. My buddy Cooper, stood up to those guys in Washington. That's my beef with the Duke. Me too. I told him that bunch in Washington were just bums trying to get ahead by ruining the lives of good people in our own industry. He told me women should stay out of politics. And I said, hell, this ain't about politics. This is about freedom, and I have every right. Well, it sounds like a bit of an argument, I'd say. Over here, we call it a Donnybrook, Maureen said. She explained what Donnybrook said. Well, I'm glad you spoke up and gave the Duke a piece of your mind. I still love him, you know. I understand. And now I think I like him better too, knowing that he got cussed out by the fiercest redhead I've ever known. I'm so proud of you. I could read on, but that's a great place to end.
It is a great place to end. And we do have a couple of minutes. I know we've got a lovely intimate gathering of family and friends. A couple of people had to drop away, but I didn't know if you folks might have some questions for Mick about his either of his books or his writing style, or so just go ahead and unmute yourself. We'll try not to talk over each other, and we'll take maybe 5 minutes if you have questions. Dana,
Well,
did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a question. I was struck by what you said, Kristen. You have the interest in knowing how this all plays out. And I guess, I'm kind of thinking about Ernest as he's leaving behind his life, but will he have any regrets later that he left, his wife and his family and so forth? I think that would be interesting to find out a few books down the road after he has lots of adventures. So that's not a question, that's a request.
Oh. Well, Mary figures as does Ms. Gellhorn. They both figure significantly in the next Hemingway book, in very positive lights too, I would add. Both of them.
All right.
Great. So stay tuned.
Yeah,
And
I don't think it came out in Ken Burns' documentary, but some of it did, about Hemingway, getting on the plane and telling her she had to go on the the steerage boat, as it were, the steerage on a freighter to go to D-Day Normandy. But what I don't think it was said, and I don't recall them showing the picture, which I've seen of Gellhorn actually on the beach at Normandy. She was the only woman, and Hemingway discusses this in his second book. Martha Gellhorn was the only woman reporter that was on the beach at Normandy for D-Day. She was the first one and the only one. In fact, no woman reporter was issued identification to be on the beach. Nobody had permission. She hid away on a medical boat going into the Normandy beach. She got off the boat, whereas Hemingway didn't. They were afraid to let him out. They figured he'd be shot, and he probably would have been. But yeah. She got out, and she was there on the beach, and there's photos of her showing her in and around a tank. And he gives her credit for that. And in the literature, he also gives her credit for her stories that she wrote on D-Day, not just his, but on hers. And what he talked about Mary Welch, and how dynamic she was, and what a great reporter she was, and what a great force, and how brave she was to stay in London during the bombing, even though she could have left at any time. And she was there working as a reporter. And in the second volume, he does give her all the credit in the world for being, I think the chapter is called something about the American lady, and it was about Mary, and just how tenacious she was, and what a strong-willed reporter and character she was. Dana.
Well, thanks, Dana. We'll look for future follow-up books resolving that. Jonathan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. So you obviously researched a lot, and I'm sure the books take, a tremendous amount of research, and you kind of just told a good anecdote about something that maybe didn't make the book. Is there anything that you remember that was like really interesting that you found in your research that couldn't make the book, or like an interesting source that was just out of the ordinary that you used and was pretty cool that you thought?
Yeah, there's something that's really cool that comes up over and over again. And everybody knows about it, sort of. They know a little bit about it, but not the whole story. The whole story is about the Hemingway Memorial, which is up the road a piece from where Kristen is at right now, in outside of Ketchum, up outside of Sun Valley, the road going up beyond that. I'm not sure of the highway number. I should know, but I don't. The memorial is a famous quote that, I don't know, people just figured just must be about Hemingway, but it was really written for a guy that he met on a brief fishing and or hunting trip back in 1939, 38, when he was first in Sun Valley, a guy by the name of Gene Van Gilder. And when Gene died, guys at Sun Valley got a hold of Hemingway and said, hey, could you write something for Gene? Gene died and had a bad accident while he was hunting. And you knew him, you're the word guy, could you write something? So he wrote this eulogy for Gene, who, by the way, in the cemetery, Gene's burial is right nearby. They weren't close friends. They only knew each other for a couple of weeks, but Hemingway wrote this great line for somebody he barely knew. And what it is, it ended up being on his memorial. So it's so significant. Best of all, he loved the fall. The leaves yellow on the cottonwoods, leaves floating on the trout streams, and above the hills, the high, blue, windless sky. Now he would be part of them forever. And that's what they said about Hemingway on his memorial. But Hemingway wrote it about a guy that he barely knew. So in my book, Hemingway's Return, the beginning of the book, I had a neighbor who was a friend of Mr. Hemingway. And so I use that same format for writing a tribute to Jack on a dedication page in the beginning, where it says, best of all, he loved sports and the outdoors. Tennis and skiing. He was a tennis professional were among his favorites. Jack was at home in the mountains where he lived, where he died. The high blue windless skies of Hemingway were special to him, the bluebird days for a skier. So too, his love of people, as he always loved, always had a kind word. And it says, let us hope that the Lord up above has a kind word for Jack. He deserves to be in the best place. Now he will be there forever. So over and over again, I use the theme of the memorial. And it comes up even with Mr. Shakespeare in the second volume.
Ooh,
Yeah.
leading us on. Well, Mick Moriarty, thank you so much for a really delightful and engaging reading. Hopefully you'll be able to come back and maybe read Hemingway's Return to England or some of your other books. That would be a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank everybody. Bye-bye.